All right, let's talk about Chinese equities. So last week we saw the K-Web hit a 52-week high. Right now it's about 2% away from there. We know some of the catalyst has been trade talks. That seems to be helping out Chinese equities. Is there more upside for these stocks? And, the big headline question, is China finally investable?
I think this has to be really predicated on the future earnings outlook and the fundamental improvement of some of the industries and companies. As part of the drivers of very strong year-to-date performance of K-Web and other some local indexes, I think was driven by this repairment of the global investor sentiment. And trade conversation is part of it. But more importantly, I think investors start to realize that China is making a lot of progress on innovation, and then such as on AI technology. I think DeepSeek moment in January was a catalyst of that. And so we tend to look at China from more a bottom-up perspective. You have to be selective, given that not all companies are created equal. And so we do see that there are companies generate very strong earnings, and not only near term, also medium, longer term.
An interesting question for you, Vivian. We just heard from our Eunice Yoon talking about 90% of the investors in the Chinese markets are retail investors. Are they focused so much on earnings? We know a lot of institutional and professional investors, they focus very much on earnings season. Are they focused on, we're talking about the retail investors in China, are they focused on other things outside these kind of fundamentals? Because one thing that really sticks out to me is a lot of Chinese consumers switching to the iPhone. We've seen a lot of reports of that. When Chinese phones seem to be more advanced, they already have foldable phones. They just already do a lot of things that we're waiting for the iPhone to do. Could we see a similar thing where some of these Chinese investors, they're not as driven by the fundamentals of the market, but just more on headlines and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, retailers, investors in general are more driven by how the market moves. And this is not only in China, also, I think, the rest of the world. And Chinese retail investors accounted for ranging from 65% to maybe 80–85% of the daily trading volume of the markets, depends on the time. And I do feel that this strong market continue to prop up more interest from the retail investors. And this may not be sustainable, given that, as you correctly point out, investors from the retail side, they tend to look at just the market movement, but not necessarily the earnings. So we'll see how this is going to play out. But that's why I mentioned earlier that you have to look at the fundamentals and the bottom-up earnings of those companies, so that as institutional investors, you can figure out and select the best companies to invest in for medium and longer term.
So, of course, it's important to point out the Chinese markets are not a monolith. There's different sectors, just like there's here in the U.S. We're just showing Chinese EV stocks. Now, they're lower because Berkshire Hathaway has sold out of its holdings of BYDs. It's putting pressure on the sector. But similar to Apple, not to make everything about Apple, these EVs, they have a very big installed base as well. They become very popular in Europe and South America and other parts of the world. Do you see the Chinese EV sector being different than the broader market just because of the growth that we've seen in recent years?
Yeah. As a market, I think EV has become a very important part of the China growth in recent years. And as you also mentioned, that now China more going overseas to grab more growth outside of China. And given that penetration outside of China remain very low. But coming to investment case, those are a little bit different. We know that EV or automakers as OEM, a business model is not very favorable, given that they do have a high capex, capital investments. And specifically in China right now, we see increased competition among different players, both on the pricing side and also on the product side. So for consumers, and this probably is a good news, given that you can access the best high-performing EVs at a very good price. But from investment perspective, this could be challenging. And this is why that you see a lot of stocks on the EV segments not doing well.